Hello, welcome to Pax Fabulous. My name is Michael. You may recognize me from 8 years ago when we were engaged to one another. Your family persuaded you to break it off with me, and I left for my service in the Navy, but here we are again. And the truth is, I never really stopped thinking about Emma by Jane Austen. Have you read this book? It's so good. Which is weird, right? I mean, if I knew Emma Woodhouse in real life, I think I would hate her. Austen famously said that Emma would be a heroine whom no one but herself will much like. She's self-important, arrogant, impolite, tactless, rude, characteristics that I cannot recommend putting on your online dating profile. But here's the thing, I don't blame Emma for those traits. See, the very first thing that Austen tells us about Emma is that she had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. Can you imagine? I don't know about you, but by the time I was 21, being distressed and vexed was so common in my life that I just scheduled it into my day. Emma Woodhouse has never felt depressed or anxious. The woman has never felt hangry. That's insane. But I think the reason I'm okay with Emma growing up as this diva who's immune to suffering is because Austen spends the rest of the book distressing and vexing our heroine as much as humanly possible. From the very first page, Emma starts to confront conflicts generated by her own behavior and traits, as well as by the people around her for the first time in her life. And by the end of the book, she's no longer somebody I would go out of my way to avoid in day-to-day life. Her tactlessness transforms into thoughtfulness. Her arrogance transforms into spunk. Her self-righteousness transforms into agency. By the end of the book, she's a heroine that we can look up to. She's Blorbo from my shows. Spoilers for a 209-year-old book, by the way. And all of the growth, all of the character development that Emma undergoes is a direct consequence of the conflicts that she experiences. It's almost like Austen thinks that conflict is a good thing. But that's crazy, right? How could conflict possibly be good? Part 1. Conflict transforms you. You may have noticed that until now I've left out one of Emma's main primary traits. She's rich. She's so rich that she doesn't think she'll ever marry. She doesn't need to. She's independently wealthy. And you know what comes with that kind of wealth? Respect and social influence. Nobody in all of Highbury will challenge or criticize her, with one very notable exception. Mr. Knightley is one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them. Gee, there's only one person in the world who is willing to openly start conflict with Emma. Maybe the way that Austen treats him will reflect the way she perceives conflict. What do you mean they get married? But here's the thing. Emma pretends like this doesn't bother her.
Mr. Knightley loves to find fault with me, you know.
Oh dear.
In a joke, it is all a joke.
Ah, yes, of course.
We always say what we like to one another.
In the movie adaptations, it's easy to believe that this is all a joke. This is just teasing, even flirting. Did you see that eye contact? Gross. But in the book, Austen gives us a peek into Emma's mind during this encounter and tells her that being admonished by Knightley is not particularly agreeable to her. She doesn't like being told that she's got room for improvement. Emma would hate Jiminy Cricket. She doesn't want a conscience. And really, does she even need one? I mean, she's always right. Whatever you say always comes to pass, her father tells her. Even her opinions have never faced resistance, even from reality. Remember when I said that I didn't blame Emma for being a bit of a brat? Austen agrees with me. The narrator openly states that having rather too much her own way is one of the real evils in Emma's life. The other real evil, by the way, is a disposition to think a little too well of herself. The two biggest evils in Emma's life are, 1, a lack of conflict, and 2, the character flaws that have resulted from it. But don't worry, Emma, we're going to vanquish both of those evils by the end of the story. And the key is conflict. I titled this section of the paper, Part 1A, sadly not the creepiest pastor I've ever heard of. The first significant conflict in the novel concerns the local vicar, Mr. Elton, and Emma's futile efforts to set him up. See, Emma has a history of playing matchmaker. The story begins with the wedding of their former governess, Miss Taylor, to Mr. Weston, a match that Emma had made 4 years earlier. She's good at this, or at least she thinks she is, and she wants to set up Mr. Elton next, specifically with her lower-class friend, Harriet Smith. I'm going to be honest with you, Harriet is an angel in the flesh, and despite her classism, Emma recognizes that, and she immediately wants to help Harriet by elevating her social status. Mr. Elton can do that for her, and obviously he wants to marry Harriet because she's just incredible. As far as Emma's concerned, who wouldn't want to marry Harriet? Hopefully Knightley, but she's not going to unpack those feelings right now. But there's an obstacle to Emma's plan here, one that she bulldozes through callously. Harriet's already in love with a farmer named Robert Martin, and he clearly loves her back, but he's not Mr. Elton. He doesn't have the social status. Emma thinks Harriet deserves better, and so when a proposal comes from Robert Martin, Emma gaslights Harriet into rejecting it.
Well, it is a good letter, and you must answer it immediately. You must have his disappointment and move on. Well, you think I should refuse him? You did not plan to return an answer favorable to this claim.
No, I did not. That is, I did not mean, well, I was not sure. That is why I came to you.
Oh, it's not my place to intrude.
Oh, but I depend so on what you think.
I would not advise you for the world.
Bull crud, Emma. You suck in this part of the story, and being played by Gwyneth Paltrow doesn't help. This version of Emma would happily run the company goop, and then she'd turn Harriet into a saleswoman for it. Knightley, as usual, is the only one to take Emma to task for her handling of the situation. You have been no friend to Harriet Smith, Emma. He also dismisses the match she's imagined between Harriet and Elton, calling it all labor in vain. This is the first major argument in the story, the first big moment of conflict, and Emma does not handle it well. She's stubborn and prideful, and she doesn't back down.
You wrote her answer. This is your doing. Emma, you persuaded her to refuse him.
Well, if I did, I should not feel that I'd done wrong.
Oh, well, this seems like a pretty calm discussion so far. I wonder if it'll stay that way.
I reckon scarcely
Probably
that
no
with a
separate
father's
provision
gentleman
for
and a gentleman of
respectful
fortune.
relation.
Oh, yeah, no, that seems about right. Anya Taylor-Joy is so good as Emma. Can you tell that this is my favorite adaptation? Hey, editor, let's just use clips from this one from now on. As it turns out, there are consequences to this conflict. Knightley holds a grudge. He distances himself from Hartfield for an unusually long time, and when he comes back, he's unforgiving. Emma, for her part, doesn't really care. She's still convinced that she's in the right, that Harriet and Mr. Elton are a dream duo. Because to change her mind would mean accepting that she was wrong, and she's never wrong. She's never been wrong before. Why would she start now? But then it turns out that she is wrong. She takes a carriage ride with Mr. Elton, and the truth comes out.
Who can think of Miss Smith when Miss Woodhouse is near? Everything I have said or done for many weeks has been with the sole view of making my adoration to yourself.
Oh no! Well, too bad there weren't, like, red flags for you to notice beforehand.
Loveliness before us in the flesh. Bear witness. Allow me. Trust me. With this commission, Miss Woodhouse, and I will ride to London the moment I am asked. It would be my great honour. I am ready to die if you refuse me. Never cared whether she were dead or alive, but as your friend.
Sir, you are a vigor. Yikes. Faced with this awkward and gut-churning confession of love, Emma realizes she's been wrong. The realization of what she's done, ruining Harriet's chances with the man who actually loved her in order to pursue her own arrogant matchmaking idea, it all sinks in. And Austen writes that every part of it brought pain and humiliation. This is the first time in the novel that those words are applied to Emma. For the first time, she is distressed and vexed by a conflict, and it begins to humble her. She reflects on her conversation with Knightley, realizing he had much truer a knowledge of Elton's character than any she had reached herself. This self-reflection and increased humility is followed by a conclusion that matchmaking is foolish and wrong, and, pay attention here, a resolution to do such things no more. Professor J. Brower defines an act of forbearance as a promise not to repeat an offense, and identifies it as one of 5 critical components of an apology that enables post-conflict reconciliation. The goal of such an apology is to move the conversation from the present to the past to the future. That's exactly what's happening here. Granted, Emma isn't offering this apology to anyone. She clearly has a lot of development still to do. But she's starting to follow this model. She moves from her present feelings of humiliation to a better understanding of her past mistakes to an act of forbearance for the future. And to her credit, Emma stops matchmaking after this. The conflict concerning Mr. Elton's marriage has changed her for the better. The second significant conflict that we need to talk about regards Miss Bates. And the thing about Miss Bates is that she really is just a yapper. Jane Austen writes characters who feel true and real in a way that no one else I can think of really does. And Miss Bates was the first time I really recognized it. Because I've known people like this in real life. Just to give you an idea of Miss Bates's character, allow me to read you a passage of her uninterrupted dialogue. This is not edited. Oh, here it is. I was sure it could not be far off, but I put my housewife upon it, you see, without being aware, and it was quite hid. But I had it in my hand so very lately that I was almost sure it must be on the table. I was reading it to Mrs. Cole, and since she went away, I was reading it again to my mother, for it is such a pleasure to her, a letter from Jane, that she can never hear it often enough, so I knew it could not be far enough, and here it is, only just under my housewife. And since you are so kind as to wish to hear what she says, but first of all, I really must, in justice to Jane, apologize for her writing so short a letter, only 2 pages, you see, hardly 2, and in general she fills the whole paper and crosses half. My mother often wonders that I can make it out so well. She often says when the letter is first opened, "Well, Hetty, now I think you will be put to it to make out all that checker work, don't you, ma'am?" And then I tell her I am sure she would contrive to make it out herself if she had nobody to do it for her. Every word of it. I am sure she would pore over it until she had made out every word, and indeed, though my mother's eyes are not so good as they were, she can still see amazingly well, still, thank God, with the help of spectacles. It is such a blessing. My mother's are really very good indeed. Jane often says when she is here, "I'm sure, Grandmama, that you must have had very strong eyes to see as you do, and so much fine work as you have done too. I only wish my eyes may last me as well." And then the next sentence, the narration is, all this spoken extremely fast, obliged Miss Bates to stop for breath. Yeah, I can tell. Point is, I adore Miss Bates, but also I would probably get very tired of her if I knew her in real life. And for that reason, I can't entirely blame Emma for what she does at Box Hill.
She demands either 1 thing very clever, or 2 things moderately clever, or 3 things very dull indeed. And she engages love-heartedly at them all.
Oh, very well then. I need not be uneasy. 3 things very dull indeed. That will do just for me. I shall be sure to say 3 dull things as soon as I open my mouth.
Ah, Mum, but there is the difficulty. When have you ever stopped at 3?
Up until this point, it's been pretty clear to the reader that Emma's attitude towards Miss Bates is, like, at best, reluctant pity. For her, the idea of becoming like Miss Bates is the worst fate imaginable. But she's kept that all pretty internalized. This is the moment when she lets it slip, when the disdain leaks out, and it happens in front of everyone.
No, I see what she means. I shall try to hold my tongue.
This poor woman, I'd be upset too. This insult wounds her to her core, and what's worse, it sets an example. At least some of the others at Box Hill will follow Emma's example because she's their social superior. No wonder Knightley rebukes her so harshly.
How could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates?
It was not so very bad.
How could you be so insolent to a woman of her character and age and situation? To have you now, in thoughtless spirits and the pride of the moment, laugh at her and humble her, and before her niece, and before others, many of whom are entirely guided by your treatment of her, it was badly done indeed.
Just as at the beginning of the novel, Knightley is the only one willing and able to find fault in Emma, the only one willing to tell her how badly done it was. And, just as at the beginning of the novel, Emma tries to laugh it off. But remember, she's changed already. She's learned that she can be wrong, and now she's learning another dimension of that. The first conflict told her that she could be wrong about other people's intentions. Now she's finding out her own intentions can be wrong. I don't know if you've ever made a mistake, but realizing it sucks. And I don't think Emma's really ever felt like that before. She's overcome by anger against herself, mortification, and deep concern. and the more she thinks about it, the worse she feels. She was vexed beyond what could have been expressed, almost beyond what she could conceal. Never had she felt so agitated, mortified, grieved at any circumstance in her life. She was most forcibly struck. The truth of this representation there was no denying. She felt it at her heart. How could she have been so brutal, so cruel to Miss Bates? How could she have exposed herself to such ill opinion in anyone she valued? Time did not compose her. As she reflected more, she seemed but to feel it more. She had never been so depressed. Emma felt the tears running down her cheeks almost all the way home, without being at any trouble to check them, extraordinary as they were. Emma screwed up, and she knows it. One of the terrible things about realizing you've made a mistake is that it makes it a lot easier to recognize all the past mistakes you've made, like a giant domino chain of regret, or Taco Bell. Emma's feelings of regret linger throughout the evening, and notably they extend past the insult dealt at Box Hill to encompass all of her past treatment of Miss Bates. She had often been remiss, her conscience told her so, scornful, ungracious. Reflecting on her past treatment of Miss Bates, Emma again swears forbearance, but it should be so no more. Again, she demonstrates the critical components of reconciliation by acknowledging her errors, exhibiting sincere remorse, determining to change, and planning to rectify the situation. She's learning. The next day, Emma pays Miss Bates a visit as an act of true contrition in hopes of initiating a regular, equal, kindly intercourse. Throughout the rest of the novel, while Emma continues to link Miss Bates with a lack of tranquility, and again, I cannot blame her for that, because it's true, her treatments and perceptions of the spinster are far more positive. And, more importantly, Emma becomes capable of self-reflection. Emma gets straight up blindsided by the revelation that Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax have been secretly engaged the whole time, because of course she does. It's an insane thing to do, and Frank, you're a walking red flag. But in my opinion, the most important thing about this revelation is the way Emma starts thinking about someone else, about Harriet. See, Emma is certain that Harriet is in love with Frank, and will be heartbroken again by the news. And while she acknowledges that Frank had behaved very ill, her anger is primarily the result of her own behavior. She keeps going over Knightley's past words in her mind. Emma, you have been no friend to Harriet Smith, and is extremely angry with herself. Two main things to note here. First of all, Emma doesn't need Knightley to rebuke her this time. She's become capable of recognizing her errors on her own. That's a huge change from the beginning of the book, when she wouldn't even take criticism seriously. Secondly, Emma never did anything wrong here. It was true that she had not to charge herself with being the sole and original author of the mischief. She didn't do anything to start this. As far as Emma can tell, Harriet has chosen Frank for herself, and all that Emma considers herself completely guilty of is having encouraged what she might have repressed. She's penitent not because of what she's done, but what she's failed to do. And the fact that Harriet is actually completely uninterested in Frank doesn't really undermine the value of Emma's sincere feelings of regret and contrition. All of this is to say that Emma changes, transforms for better through the course of her story, specifically by engaging with conflict and adversity. Both her conflict with Mr. Elton about his confession of love and her conflict with Mr. Knightley about Miss Bates teach her important lessons that make her a better person by the end of the story. Being distressed and vexed ends up being a good thing. Conflict is good for you. And I kind of hate that, don't you? Part 2, Smog and Cocoons. I want to tell you a story. A few years ago, I lived with a pair of brothers who were absolutely terrible roommates. 2 to 4 times a week, they'd invite a bunch of friends over to our apartment and cook dinner for all of them, which isn't so bad, except that it meant using a lot of dishes, and they never washed a single dish. I swear, the entire time we lived together, they never washed anything, unless it was time to reuse it again. Often they'd leave their dirty pans in the oven, where they would remain until I found them after preheating the oven to make my own food, forcing me to suddenly deal with a hot metal pan of melted grease. Absurdly inconsiderate. They'd invite girls over after curfew, they'd take up half our small fridge with alcohol, they'd leave their beard shavings all over the bathroom counter. I remember one night they had friends over in their room, which was next to ours, and one of them was just bouncing a ball against the wall, like a basketball or soccer ball or something, which is fine, except that it was past midnight. They frustrated me to no end, and yet I was peaceful. I did their dishes for them. I cleaned the apartment. I gave them space when they had people over. I was at peace. Just kidding, I was full of rage. Here's the thing, I was doing all those purposeful things not out of a sense of forgiveness or reconciliation, but out of passive aggression. I was hoping that they'd notice and realize that they were inconveniencing me, and then they'd stop being such terrible roommates. Did that work? Of course it didn't. What I needed to do was confront them openly about it, to set boundaries, be assertive. But I didn't. I was scared of conflict. Conflict is scary. It's destructive. It's negative. It's distressing and vexing, for heaven's sake. So how does it make Emma Woodhouse a better person? According to Professor Chadford, one of the biggest factors in determining whether a conflict is destructive or not is how we perceive it. Having a negative perception of conflict adds to both perpetuation and the escalation of it. And as a corollary, having a positive perception of conflict enables positive outcomes. The way we think about conflict changes how we behave, and that changes what's possible. In his book Dangerous Love, Ford proposes two ways for viewing conflict, either positively or negatively. We tend to default to a negative view of conflict, and that's why conflicts tend to be negative. Perceive conflict negatively, especially the people we are stuck in conflict with, and things start going downhill quickly. The more exhausted we become, the angrier or more frustrated we get, the more likely we are to escalate the conflict and unwittingly create even more of it. A belief that conflict is destructive just encourages us to behave in destructive ways, which just ensures that we're correct about the conflict being destructive. This perception of conflict as an inherently bad thing is what Ford calls a smog view. No one likes smog. The smog metaphor paints conflict as inconvenient and restrictive, the result of some external force that we cannot escape. It is everywhere, and unless all of us start living differently, it's not going away. That's what makes smog so frustrating. While I could walk to work or cut emissions to reduce my contribution to the smog epidemic, it will matter little unless others do the same. So why even try, since we know others won't change? That's how I was viewing the conflict with my roommates. Not only was I scared of conflict itself, I was also convinced that my roommates wouldn't change. They weren't people, they were an unstoppable force, and if I stepped in the way, I'd get flattened. So I might as well just keep washing the dishes and trying not to breathe in the smog. So that's what I did. And you know what changed? Nothing. The situation didn't change. My roommates didn't change. If I changed at all, it was for the worse, as I got angrier and more stubborn and more entrenched in my perceptions of both my roommates and conflict. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's another way to view conflict, a different metaphor, one that is all about changing for the better. The cocoon metaphor, which came from one of the students in Ford's class. Conflict is like a cocoon. We think life is just great as a caterpillar, walking around, eating leaves. It's what every caterpillar does. And then suddenly we get trapped in this confining, claustrophobic space, a chrysalis, for weeks or even months or years. We want to run away, go back to just eating leaves, but we can't. The process is terrifying. The caterpillar has to die so that it can become something else. When we emerge from the chrysalis, we see ourselves and the people around us differently. Not only are we free, but we're a butterfly now. Life becomes so much more than walking around eating leaves. Now we can fly. The idea here is that conflict is a constructive and a transformative thing, that we can develop new capabilities and skills through it, that we change for the better. Sound familiar? I know a Regency romance heroine who might see things this way. And to be clear, the cocoon metaphor isn't like rose-colored glasses. It's not blindly positive or naive. Caterpillars get liquefied inside their chrysalis. That's uncomfortable. This perception of conflict doesn't pretend that it's going to be totally chill and pleasant. It could suck, but it's going to be so worth it. In the end, it's going to make you better, and it could make the other party better, and you could come up with a solution that everyone's happy with. See, there's more to these ideas of constructive and destructive conflict than just the way we view it. There really are patterns of behavior and engagement that are negative and destructive, regardless of how you view conflict. I'm not trying to pretend that it's all in your head, that it's all the way you look at it. But the way you look at it is where things begin. Seeing conflict as something that can transform us opens up a whole new tool chest of resources that aren't there when we are engaged in smog thinking. It goes both ways. Conflict can make you better, and you can make conflict better. And who better to learn from than Emma Woodhouse? Part 3, you transform conflict. Because there's one more major conflict Emma's got to deal with before her story ends, and it's a doozy. See, she goes to Harriet to break the news about Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, and to her surprise, Harriet isn't all that broken up. In fact, Harriet doesn't really care at all. And then the truth comes out. Turns out, Harriet's actually in love with Knightley. Uh-oh, Emma, what's this? A sudden realization that you're also in love with Knightley? Well, at least this realization came at a time that was convenient for everyone. Oh no! Now's as good a time as any to actually define conflict. The authors of the textbook Interpersonal Conflict, 11th edition, define conflict as an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goals. For instance, in the first conflict we discussed, Emma's goals of having Mr. Elton propose to Harriet were incompatible with Mr. Elton's goals of proposing to Emma. In this conflict, we're talking about scarce resources, because there is only one George Knightley, and everyone wants him because of course they do. Heck, even I'd fall in love with the guy. So now Emma is in conflict with her best friend, and the stakes have never been higher. Luckily though, Emma's changed a lot since the beginning of her story, and one of the biggest ways she's changed is in the way she sees Harriet. I go into more depth about this in my Princess Mononoke video, but the way we see people in conflict is just as important as the way we see conflict itself. Ford tells us to see conflict as constructive, see the people involved in the conflict as people with equally valid, if not similar, desires, fears, and wants, and you're likely to turn your conflict into something positive. At the beginning of the story, Emma's view of Harriet is as an inferior, an unrefined and pitiful creature, albeit one that can be elevated through Emma's influence. She's not a person, she's a project to be completed, a gem to be cut and polished. That attitude is part of what causes the first conflict with Mr. Elton. Emma just orchestrates in romance for Harriet because she knows better. But as the story proceeds, Emma spends more time with Harriet, and she can't help but start to see her as a person with just as much value and legitimacy as herself. When dealing with the emotional fallout of Mr. Elton's confession, Emma admits that, compared with the evil to Harriet, all her own distress was light. She's feeling genuine empathy and compassion there, not just a sense of personal failure. By the time she's listening to Harriet talk about her love for Knightley, she fully sees Harriet as an equal, if not socially, then spiritually. And she comes to believe that Knightley does love Harriet back. In fact, despite her own feelings for the man, Emma is willing to be Harriet's wingwoman on this, to assist his resolution or reconcile it to him by giving just praise to Harriet, even though she knows it will cost her. This is what we call an accommodating conflict style. Emma is just kind of giving in to avoid causing a problem, the same way that I washed my roommate's dishes for them. And it's usually not super healthy. Luckily though, this isn't where the conflict ends. Unluckily, this is where I feel that Austen kind of drops the ball. I'm sorry, Jane, but this is a romance novel, and so romantic love is going to win out over other kinds of loves, and not necessarily in a healthy role model kind of way. See, Emma and Knightley have a conversation, and Knightley confesses that he loves Emma. He always has. Just ignore the age difference. And in the novel, at this point, Emma just stops viewing Harriet as a person anymore. I get it, love is heavenly, and to be loved is divine, but in my opinion, her thoughts about Harriet at this point are indefensible. In damning words, she thinks that Harriet was nothing, that she was everything herself. And look, nobody is perfect. It's actually really realistic that Emma struggles to keep seeing people as people. If it were easy, we'd all do it all the time. But it doesn't make her a great role model. At least not in the book, but in the 2020 film adaptation, I love what they do here.
Will you marry me? Emma.
Oh.
Emma.
She freaking short circuits. The movie's Emma goes full Stranger Things and has a nosebleed because suddenly her love for Harriet and her love for Knightley and even her love for herself have all become apparently irreconcilable. And then see what she does.
I cannot.
Why not?
Harriet!
Harriet?
If she's in love with you! If she believes that you may love her too, and you danced with her, and shown her kindness, and took notice of her and done well and spoken and seen to the verge of asking if her affections were engaged.
To Robert Martin! To Robert Martin! She told you this!
I cannot break her heart again!
Emma cares about her best friend so much that she has a full mental and emotional breakdown, crying out, "I cannot break her heart again. Queen, I love her." So now the conflict has become significantly more complicated. It's time for a new strategy, one of those new resources unlocked by having a cocoon view of conflict. Let's talk about principled negotiation. Principled negotiation is the brainchild of Roger Fisher and William Ury of the Harvard Negotiation Project, and it's a strategy for approaching negotiations. They present it as an alternative to the traditional strategy of positional bargaining, where parties extend offers and counteroffers until an agreement is reached. Consider this famous example. A sister goes to the kitchen to grab an orange, only to find that her sister has already grabbed the last one. "I'll have this one," offers the first sister, "and you can have the next one Mom buys." "No deal," rejects the second sister. "We don't know when Mom's going shopping next. You had the last orange, give me this one." "I don't think so," says the first sister. "Let's just split it in half." "Fine," the second sister relents. They cut the orange in half, and each sister takes their cut. This is positional bargaining. It's compromise. It's a win-win, right? Well, not exactly. See, it's more like a win-lose, win-lose. One sister goes to her room, eats her half of the orange, and throws away the peel. The other sister stays in the kitchen, uses the peel for a recipe, and tosses out the rest of the orange. Each sister got what they want, but not as much as they wanted. They won, but they also had to lose in order to win. Frankly, this is a bit of a weird story, but it illustrates the issue with positional bargaining. Even when it's effective, it tends to lead to solutions that are unsatisfying for everyone involved. What's more, it encourages you to see the other party as an object that you're trying to move into position. And we're trying to see the other side as people. So we need something else. Principled negotiation is an approach that aims to produce wise outcomes efficiently and amicably. There are 4 basic components of principled negotiation, and 3 of them come into play in Emma. Now, to be fair, Emma and Harriet never really enter negotiations about Knightley. They don't sit down at a table and say, "Well, we're both in love with the man, what solutions can we find?" They don't bring in King Solomon the Wise as a mediator so he can cut Knightley in half like an orange. Most of the resolution to this conflict happens on Emma's side, but that doesn't mean she doesn't use the principles of principled negotiation in figuring out a solution. For instance, the first step in principled negotiation is to separate the people from the problem. This involves practicing empathy, validating emotions, and communicating. As we've discussed, movie Emma is perfect at this. Book Emma isn't. That being said, she still does separate Harriet from the problem. Principled negotiation tells us not to blame the other person for your problem. And she doesn't blame Harriet for loving Knightley. If anything, she blames herself for it. And while she gives priority to her own feelings, Book Emma does validate Harriet's emotions, which is part of the process. Emma knows the problem isn't Harriet. It's the fact that they both love Knightley. That's the first step in principled negotiation. The next step is to focus on interests rather than positions. In this context, the positions proposed by both Harriet and Emma are their desires to marry Knightley. Those are clearly mutually exclusive, at least they were back when this story took place. So let's focus on interests instead. Both Emma and Harriet want to marry, 1, someone who is kind to them. This should come as a surprise to no one. If you're not expecting this from your romantic partner, raise your standards or I'll raise them for you. 2, someone who has at least as much social status as themselves. Marrying up is great, marrying down is not. That's why Emma felt the need to reassure Harriet that there had been matches of greater disparity than her and Frank Churchill. Class is a huge part of Austen's novels, and the characters know that. 3, someone to whom they feel attracted. Again, you would think this would be common sense. So let's look at our criteria and Knightley. Knightley is kind to both Emma and Harriet, so he meets the first requirement. He has about the same social standing as Emma, and he'd be a step up for Harriet, so he fulfills the second requirement. And they're both in love with him, so he meets the third requirement for both of them as well. And that leads us to the third part of principled negotiation, inventing options for mutual gain. Here's the thing, Emma has feelings for no one else, and to be honest, there really aren't any other single guys who have treated her kindly. Knightley really is her only option for marriage, and he picked her too. What Emma needs to do is invent a new option for Harriet. And luckily, there is absolutely another man who meets these criteria. Robert Martin is a kind man who was head over heels for Harriet and was pretty much shattered when she turned him down. That's the first requirement. As a farmer, he doesn't have much social standing, but as a foundling, Harriet doesn't either. He can provide for her financially and socially, and therefore he meets the second requirement. And finally, and most importantly, Harriet still loves him. Yeah, she turned down his proposal, but only because Emma convinced her to. Look at this face and tell me she's really getting over him. No, I don't think so. She's still in love with that man. And that's good. This is the new option that will help both Emma and Harriet to have their interests satisfied. Now, in an ideal mediation, the parties in conflict would be the ones to come up with the new options together. And in Emma, Knightley is the one to come up with the idea. But here's another change that the 2020 movie makes that I absolutely adore.
Oh, no. No, I must do it. I must go. Mr. Martin, I have a confession to make. I have caused you great suffering, as I have also caused the suffering of my friend. My dearest friend.
Emma, you absolute princess of reconciliation. Do you have any idea how much humility that must have taken for her? She quite literally lowers herself socially to go visit the Martins, something that pre-conflict Emma never would have done, by the way. And then she encourages Robert's reconciliation to Harriet. And it turns out so well. They're so happy together. Can you tell that I like this movie? It's the Beth adaptation, and I will fight Gwyneth Paltrow to the death on that hill. And really, it's surprising that it ends so well, right? This conflict pitted Emma Woodhouse against her best friend, and the stakes were higher than they'd ever been before. And if the past was anything to go off of, things looked bad. The last time a man ended up having feelings for Emma instead of Harriet, everyone got hurt by it. It was a recipe for disaster, for destruction. But instead, the conflict was constructive. It wasn't a zero-sum game. Everyone ended up happily ever after, and it's because of what Emma did. It's because of who Emma was, who Emma had become. She transformed the conflict because conflict had transformed her, and in the process, she undid the damage she'd done in the past. Look, Emma isn't a perfect peacemaker by any means. I mean, do you remember how she started out? Sure, the conflicts she's experienced have transformed her for the better, and she's learned to view others as people, but she doesn't always do that, and she's not as assertive or active in the process of principled negotiations as mediation experts say she should be. She's still imperfect. But then again, all peacemakers are imperfect. I've been studying peace and conflict for about 2 years now, and I still suck at it. I'm in a class right now where every day we do like role plays of conflict mediation like they do in Small Claims Court, and I dread it every single time. My default response to conflict is still fear and the impulse to flee, to avoid. I still have a Smog view of conflict, even though I've worked so hard to get a Cocoon view of conflict. But it's okay. This isn't about being perfect. It's about improving. It's about getting a little bit better here and there, every now and then, as much as you can. Emma isn't perfect, but she's trying, and that counts. And you're not perfect, and that's okay. Nobody with any grasp on reality is expecting perfection from you, so stop expecting it from yourself. Just expect improvement and work towards it. I know it might be scary. Some of the biggest conflicts we face in life are the ones inside of us, and conflict can be scary if you choose to see it that way, but it can transform you, just like it transformed Emma, just like it transformed me. So what about you? Are you going to let it transform you? Are you going to keep holding your breath, trying not to breathe in the smog? Or are you going to let go and climb into a cocoon and let it conflict transform you into a beautiful, breathtaking butterfly? Are you going to let conflict destroy you? Are you going to transform it and let it build you up? What would Emma do? Part 4, the narrative parallels between Emma Woodhouse and Princess Amber Winslow of Enchantia. Just kidding, y'all aren't ready for that video, but you might be ready for one of the other videos I have on my channel right now. These were all put together as part of a pre-building project for that class I mentioned, and the goal is just to use stories that I love to help teach principles about peace and conflict. So if you have any ideas or any thoughts about this video or its topics, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. And until next time, peace.